Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to our last session, and this is about the hands-on experience, our practical work about a student project and an exhibition, and I'm going to tell you more in a minute, but now I would like to introduce to you our two first speakers. This is my colleague Jan Hermelink. Mr. Hermeling is a professor for practical theology at the theological faculty of the University of Göttingen. And together with GERALD that I'm going to introduce to you later, we were in charge of a student project in Hanover, and he will tell us more about it. So I won't comment any further on it. And then there's our second speaker, GERALD. He is an architect and he also works at the Theological University in Marburg and also at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And that is why we know each other. He is the owner of Prinzmetal Architects and he's specialized in church building and participation. So the next 38 minutes are yours. The floor is yours. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your warm words of welcome. And we are going to present to you an exhibition, which is actually the outcome of an interdisciplinary seminar. The disciplines are architecture, urban planning, and theology. So students from Göttingen, for example, that will join us later for discussion. And Kerstin Gothe actually initiated this seminar, and she also talked to church leaders in Hanover, and that's how we come across this congregation. So my colleague and I, we somehow jumped on the bandwagon, and the title of the seminar and the exhibition refers to the basic idea, the church of tomorrow, planning for tomorrow, possibility space or space of opportunity at Hannover Roderbruch. And actually, this space of opportunity is the community center Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which was built at the end of the 1970s. And this congregation, which was founded in the 1970s, mainly focused on welfare. And they, of course, were tried together with two very committed pastors, tried to improve networking in this neighborhood. And this part of the city has different neighborhoods. So we have single family houses, high rise buildings, but also prefabricated buildings with a lot of families with a migration background. So it is often called Roderbruch, and it had a tarnished reputation in the past, but then there was a moving neighborhood discussion. There was some funds provided by the Social City Project, and now we see some economic awakening. And the community center actually is situated right at the center of the neighborhood. There is a market square, tram connection, a big shopping mall, a comprehensive school, and as far as the architecture of this community center is concerned, it is on one hand, it opens up to the market square with a lot of windows and doors and a big foyer leading to a number of community and meeting places and a big church hall on the other hand. This building, and this is not the intention of the architects and the neighborhood, it somehow is a bit distanced when it comes to the neighborhood. There is a thrift shop that you may see on the picture. It is often closed, and the green space right behind the center are very difficult to access and they look a bit run down. So the mission of this seminar was the following: The question that was supposed to be answered by the students was, what can this congregation do in order to reuse this building in order to open up to the neighborhood? What can we do about these different community spaces and the big church hall in order to make it accessible to many different groups in order to use it for different religious and cultural purposes? Because, well, this community center accommodates a lot of different groups. There is a free church and social initiatives, but maybe we can open up it even further in order to live up to the expectations of Dietrich Bonhoeffer that lent his name to this center. Well, these are missions that you may be familiar with, but maybe you haven't heard about the way we approached this mission. And what you can see at the exhibition, there's also a brochure on it. You can see 3 different designs, ideas on how to design this church building, and many ideas on how to recast this church building. And actually, they are based on an interdisciplinary approach. There were 2 workshops in autumn and winter 2019 and 2020. This was way before COVID-19. And we were right on site at this community center at Roderbruch. So there were the architects that were involved, urban planners and theologists. They worked in an interdisciplinary way in mixed groups. So first of all, the idea was to explore this part of the city. This is what you can see in the picture. So either by foot together with experts, there was the mayor of this district, and a number of Muslims that are very committed in this neighborhood. And then we had elderly people and young adults cooking for us. And most of the students, they spent the night at the homes of members of the congregation. And at the second day, we started our design process. And again, these were mixed groups consisting of theologists and architects. Ideas were exchanged, rooms were measured, photos were taken. We had a lot of sketches. The the architect, the practical theologist, and the professor for urban planning, looked into these groups. And at the end of the first workshop, there was a first presentation to the congregation. And then, of course, during the next workshop, there were more projects. And then we had a revision stage and we had a kind of after work party. So basically, this teaching and learning process is a kind of condensed planning process. So all these explorations, discussions, sketches, presentations, discussions, changes, fine-tuning, well, this was all condensed and happened during very few days, well, 3 months. There were a lot of irritations, misunderstandings, conflicts, you name it. But before presenting some of the highlights of these designs to you, and what you can see here is actually the first one, I would like to tell you more about the challenges um, due to this interdisciplinary approach. Well, when studying theology at a university, this is mainly all about text from the Bible, text from the history of Christianity, other religions, theoretical text. Sometimes, of course, we watch a film or analyze pastoral care or artwork, but usually what we do is interpreting texts, producing new texts, essays, sermons. But now at the community center of Roderbruch, well, what we did was completely different because we prepared some short presentations with a lot of pictures, but then we went to explore the town together with the urban planners. This was quite new because we were tracing, painting it again and again, tearing it apart, remodeling it. So we didn't use words, but we used glue sticks and pens. And the outcome was not text, but models and sketches and designs. And what was also new to our theologists was the objective of this work, public presentation, because what architects do, always considering the request of builders, it is a quite normal thing to do to present your work to others. But for theologists, well, this what was quite new because you need to present something very quickly and people need to understand what you were presenting. And then the question was, what can theology actually do? What is the substantial contribution that we can make? And this actually was quite a challenge. But of course, for the architecture students, this was also a challenge.
Exactly. I would like to mention three major challenges that makes it so special for and makes it different to the classical working for students in these fields. First of all, the immediate work at the site itself with somebody, with a responsible person who has their own idea and to use all these available information, but also to present ideas that have to work there in that place where we are. So as a student, you have to actually see the need that are there in place. It's different if you just get everything you presented to you in a silver platter in the university, but this was dealing with real people. And of course, you have to be able to defend your idea and your um, layout or your design and present it and yeah, defend what you have developed and be able to answer questions. The second aspect was the interdisciplinary work approach. So you don't remain in your own discipline, in your field of theology or city planning, but you have to think out of the box and have to reorient yourself and have to reflect on what you believe. But what was so interesting about it was that you have all these new aspects that are more about the intuitive developing and that you gained completely new perspectives on your usual work, on what you normally do. And you always challenge, why are you doing this? Why are you doing it this way? And you have to reflect much more on what you do because you need to defend and present it, especially against the background of theology and sociology. The third challenge was, I think for me, it was the biggest challenge was that there was no clear task, no defined task, what we were to do. Usually you get a task, you have usually a spatial program which is quite clear about what the needs are, which criteria, how big the rooms have to be, what they will be used for, etc. We didn't have that. And also at that point for the church, it was kind of clear, well, we have a new quarter that is being developed. And so the church has to be thought in this quarter as a center in this neighborhood. But we didn't have all these premises at that point because we had to think, well, what will be the main purpose, the main task of this building? How can we create a new center for this neighborhood? How can this community hall help to identify this center or this neighborhood? These three challenges I've just mentioned, they were core and key to our work. And I would like to just give you three examples of concepts that were developed. This was always a result of group work. So usually it was 2 architectural students together with 1 theology student as a team. The first project I would like to present is what we called Church as a Host. So the team decided that because of the loss of the importance of the church hall, that they wanted to use it in a different way, and they wanted to enlarge it and expand it. The church hall becomes a center of the new neighborhood, and the building is linked with the real life of those that live around it, and offers spaces for religion, for Christian, as well as for Muslims. We have here a room for Christian worship, for Christian prayer, and then there is another room for Muslim prayers. So they especially emphasized spaces in between that connected these 2 different spaces where people can meet from the different religions and spaces. A church for everybody and for others, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, after whom this is named. So they've taken on his ideas to make the church a place where, in times of tensions and separations in society, we now create spaces that bring people together. So the students thought about how this can be organized if this church hall is expanded and has more functions, then the church should still remain as an institutional host of the whole building and complex and will be the umbrella for all these activities. This is another floor plan. You can see the various buildings and the spaces of encounter in between. If you look at the sketch, you can see that these connecting zones, that these are quite large, and this was really about having enough space for this encounter. These are various scenarios how these rooms can be used in a multifunctional way. The second idea, the second project, was in a way a bit similar, but still realized in a different way. We called it the interreligious campus. So this is the original church building, which is supplemented with a multi-religious space, a room, which is called a hospitality room for various world religions. And these 2 spaces have then this axis of religion, and there is a second axis which is more cultural. In between, there is an exterior space that is meant as a space for encounter and for sharing. This is another layout, a floor plan. You can see the existing church building here. This is what we have. And here is again a supplement. We have additional rooms, additional space in order to make this a space for encounter. And this is another visualization from the outside in this newly created outdoor space. The third project dealt with the garden of the community hall, and they designed a multi-coded space. What's remarkable about this work is that this foyer, which for everybody involved was seen as the great quality, that the students decided to actually demolish this foyer and replace it with exterior spaces. You can see it under this yellow roof, because they said, well, this foyer, this hall, this actually results in a separation of the buildings. It's just separated and people do not connect. And if you open it up, then you have more connection. You have a connection between the church hall and the original church building. And so in this way, you have better connections in this quarter, in this neighborhood. This is again supplemented by some minor changes to the buildings that are already there, just to improve their quality. So, for example, the former worship room has been changed to a multifunctional room in order to be able to use it for other events. Then you see the garden here, which also acts as a connection between the two sides to connect the people and the various rooms and spaces. And once more, you can see the small chapel, which also has been improved and can now be used as a chapel, as a worship room. And it's another example for these minimal changes that have been done. Jan, I would hand the floor back to you. Yes, I would like to add a couple of things from a theological perspective. Maybe you can go back to the other image. And then we'll come back to the tasks. So there are three things I would like to mention. First of all, as a theologian, we were able to remind the architects sometimes that religion is not just service. It's not just about worship. It's also an individual use of holy spaces for prayer, maybe just to light a candle, maybe to just calm down. And religious practice also involves education, to have small groups, to have choirs, for example, drama groups. These are all other religious practices. It's not just the big service. So from this perspective, religion is something that you do individually. And this has to be included into our designs to have a multi-religious room that can be used between the foyer and the marketplace. At the moment, this room is being used as a storage space. So the roots for this new room of silence are, of course, in religion. And so we have this theological contribution to make. Secondly, for all of us, it was surprising that the most designs that you have seen actually want to include and invite other religions and even give them spaces to themselves. But it was important for us theologically that this opening towards other religions is not justified by the point that the Muslims have not enough space for their prayers, but this interreligious hospitality can even be justified by religious traditions in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we used examples from our tradition of opening up towards other religions, and then we thought about how can we implement this in architecture by an integrative cafe, for example. And the third point is the relationship between religious and cultural practice. You've seen this before. There's the cultural axis and the religious axis. You know, you can separate the two in some designs, but it's still, it goes back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, after whom this complex is named. It said church, he says, has to be church for others. Church has to be with others and for others in the everyday life of their people, in their encounter, in their coming together and helping each other. In this practice together, it becomes clear what it means to be Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has become a human being. And this is exactly when you go back to the community hall, the church hall, that's the basic idea of the building itself. Here we can see it again. You see it that everyday life and church, everything is connected. Prayer and diaconia, everyday life, it's all together in one building. And we want to have a mix. And we want to have rooms and spaces that can be used in various ways and connect these two aspects. Let's get back to the question, that theology students have to deal with. So what's our contribution from the field of theology to the design process? What is our contribution? How can we make this visible? The theologians were important in the teams because they had their religious knowledge. So what do we need in a church? What do we need in a mosque or in a synagogue? What kind of events take place in a sacred space? And the theologians also thought about the perspective of the users, both the users at the moment, but also the future users of these spaces. So it could be that the Christian users may have a bit of a problem with the idea that there is just a general purpose prayer room. And we try to explain why this oasis has to be a nice landscape with a baptismal font and some benches, where it's so important for all these congregation members. You know these roles from your planning processes. Religious knowledge has to be included, but there were two more aspects, which is, first of all, theologians asked about the actors that would have some kind of responsibility in these buildings. What does it mean for these people if he suddenly is a facility manager of an interreligious center? So, what kind of qualification do we need for the person who runs a cafe in there to be part of a Christian center? So, you see the first choices here. And last but not least, what's the role of the pastor? What does she need to do, to work with all these passageways and these places of encounter? And at the same time, her job is also to give a place for the Christian congregation. And finally, a new role for theologians was also, and it took us some time to mention this, to recognize it, to have some ideas about hospitality or encounter in the garden, and to deepen those ideas, not just legitimize them, to criticize them. I mean, of course, pastors can do that, and also university professors, but the idea was a bit different. The idea was to have a contribution to the basic thoughts, to deepen what this is based on, with referring to Christian stories, biblical stories, traditions, and so on. So, especially where the designs may be new and irritating, they were meant to be transparent for their religious roots, as a way of a playful expansion of the horizon by the theological roots. And we think that this is the sense of religion, to have to open up your own viewpoint.
Thank you very much. It's just a brief summary of both of us. Well, when thinking about this project, we are of the opinion that churches do not only have this religious public impact, but they don't have any hierarchy. They don't have any, they are prone to appropriation. And of course, it is their mission to promote religious exchange and reflection. And maybe the number of operators becomes smaller, but this does not mean that these rooms become less significant. Museums and libraries, they also have to find a new mission, and this is something that churches also have to do. Expanding this program of churches and community centers will make it possible for different neighborhoods to take part and participate. And of course, this can be a place for festivities, for service, church service, educational work, or a garden for reflection. And this helps people to meet and promote exchange, and the potential to create such a campus of religious practice was actually the main focus of the work of the students. So there were the structural extension of the building, or even developing the existing stock further. And of course, from the perspective of the theologians, I can also tell you that there were a lot of learnings that we could take home. On the one hand, we were forced to think about this question of sacred space. What does sacred space actually mean? Because what can these rooms accommodate and what is it that they shouldn't accommodate? And maybe there are new architectural opportunities that we haven't thought of yet. And last but not least, we as theologians, we somehow were facing this resistance of material. What about the impact of a gallery or the curtains in inside a church? Or what is the religious charm of a smoking area? And does it change the religious charm of a garden if you have a hedge instead of a wall? And of course, one of the main lessons was, well, there's no point in having the most beautiful room for reflection if you don't have enough space for storage in a church. Thank you very much, Mr. Hermelink and Mr. KLAHR. There's one thing that I would like to add because this question came up in our chat and who provided the funds for it. Actually, the Hans Linje Foundation and the Evangelical Church, they both funded this project. I was the initiator, but we were supported by the Protestant Church, and they also helped us to get into touch with this congregation. Unfortunately, there's not much time left to answer your question, but there is at least one question that I would like to pass on to you. Well, the question was, what is the impact on the congregation? And was there any useful outcome for them? First of all, it's the process that is relevant and essential here. When I was listening to your presentation, I wondered what would have happened if we had taken these plans right into the center of this congregation. I think we would have met with a lot of resistance, but since we had these 4 days of work and it was a kind of the ongoing development, people were quite open-minded to this process. So that's why this was really a key. And then the congregation had very clear ideas of what they wanted it to be. Due to COVID, they did not really manage to implement this, but I was under the impression that a lot of things were going on and that we made a lot of progress. Well, so far these plans have not been put into practice yet. But before these workshops took place, well, things were different. Just 2 things that I would like to add. Well, we had the feeling that this community center, well, was perceived differently by the people living in that area and by the Muslims there because there was more exchange, which was promoted by these 20 students that were present. So these were very committed Muslims in that neighborhood, and they said, we need space. Do you think this would be possible? But then we had some conflict with representatives of the church. Gerald? Yeah, I think there were what is also part of this work were like smaller cosmetic changes, for example, refurbishing the chapel or open up these rooms inside the church for different uses. And this of course help to give people food for thought. Well, the two pastors of this congregation are present today, and I really hope that they will join our working group later on. And we also have some of the students here. Actually, they are no longer students because they graduated in the meantime. They will be present too. And all those of you who would like to join us, please feel free to do so. So this was the first part of this final session. And now I would like to introduce Mrs. KLEEFISCH-JOBST to you. She is an art historian, and first she worked as a freelancer as an architectural critic, but since 2008 she has been the manager of the Museum of Architecture and Engineering in North Rhine-Westphalia in Gelsenkirchen. It is great that there is such a museum, and she will present to you the exhibition Curse and Blessing of St. Gertrude in Cologne. And we have already mentioned how important education is, especially when it comes to modern churches. And I consider her work and this exhibition as an important element of this education. And I'm really delighted to see you here today joining us. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Kota. I hope that you can see the beginning of this presentation. You were absolutely right in saying that we as a museum consider ourselves to be an educational place. And I think this ties in really nicely with the presentation that we have just heard, because as a museum of architecture, we put our focus on the architectural elements, and the name of our exhibition was Curse and Blessing, Modern Churches. Well, North Rhine-Westphalia has 6,000 churches, and 1/3 of these churches will become redundant. So they will lose their sacred functions, and some of them will be demolished. And what is particularly difficult is the situation of modern churches that were built after 1910. And of course, those built in the post-war area. So the density of these churches is the highest in Germany. It's not only a question of quantity, but it's also of high architectural quality, built by Rudolf Schwarz, Dominikus and Gottfried Böhm, Emil Stephan. If congregations today face the question as to what are the churches that are supposed to be reused, well, it's always difficult for modern churches because they do not really correspond to our idea of a church building. It's very difficult for people to decipher the code of these modern churches. We said it's built theology, and liturgy helps them find their space, helps to define their space. And we shouldn't forget these aspects, because modern churches, they were built against the backdrop of two world wars. And for us, it was very important to put this idea um, into practice. And that's why we had this exhibition. And what we tried to do was to show these buildings and their different meanings. So I would like to share the next slide with you. Here it is. So the Museum of Architecture and Engineering Art does not have a building of its own, but we just take our exhibition to different places. And this, of course, helps us to kind of bring together the place of the exhibition and the topic of the exhibition. And that's why this took place in St. Gertrude in Cologne. The architect was Gottfried Böhm, and it was built between 1962 and 1965. Here you can see a picture of this church. So it was not, there was no profanation. It is still used for services, but only on very rare occasions, and it is used for exhibitions. And there are a lot of congregation members. They would like to have this church to be an open space because rooms in churches are very different from everyday space that we use. And this is how this church looks. If you look at the inside of the church, and the question as to how to convey these different meanings, this was actually quite a challenge. So what did we do? Well, special there were no special exhibition boards, but we used the room the way it was. We left it empty, and we wanted the visitors to feel the difference between the busy streets and the calm room of the church. The bright day and the dark of the church. There was also a special order. There was an order artist creating a special order for this church, because this is also one of the most important senses, smelling. So these are all the senses that we need in order to perceive architecture and to find out that after a bit of time that you can see the peak of this room. And the idea was to create this special atmosphere. So this was one layer of the exhibition. And here you can see the four different levels. The second was called Liturgy as Builder, and the idea was to show this relation between the altar and the church hall. This is quite important to modern churches, also considering the Reformation movement in Christian churches in the 20th century, and of course, interpreting this relation. And the third level was called church buildings, built theology, because we know that these shapes, of course, have a wider meaning, referring to the bigger context, because St. Gertrude looks like a tent, and the tent, of course, represents this migration movement of the people of God. And well, this is something that only very few people will be aware of when entering this church. And the fourth level is on the liturgical equipment and artifacts and their function.
So how did we do that? This is a picture of the opening of the exhibition. We had chairs in order to sit down. We didn't have that in the exhibition later on. We also projected various pieces of text to the walls, various things. There were statements in order to be able to have new thoughts in the experience of this space. There was a brochure, a leaflet, that people could see and people could maybe read about specific aspects. Maybe they didn't understand right away, or they wanted to have more detail. Originally, we just wanted to use this leaflet for the exhibition, but people liked to take it with them at home. So these were the impressions. Here you have another exhibition of the baptismal font, for example, and an icon. And with this deepening of the various levels, the visitors then came to the second part of the exhibition, which was curse or blessing, change church buildings in change. This is the image of the crypt. We still have the altar in it. And this is the exhibition that in this crypt that now deals with the question, well, if we have understood how these buildings need to be read, what does it mean for the question? Well, how do we deal with other users, non-sacred users, with profane users, and to rebuild these spaces? Just to be very brief, we'll have a quick look at the exhibition. You can go back to this on the platform, on the internet platform for this conference. This wasn't about having a huge kaleidoscope of various reuse concepts, but it was more about having three important topics that were discussed. First of all, we had this text. This was the result of a survey that was done in 2018 about the acceptance of a reuse, repurpose of churches and chapels. Most people accepted cultural uses or educational purposes, and not many people accepted churches as a fitness club or as a commercial space. What I found interesting was that only 39% of those surveyed said they can imagine the use of church by another religion. So this is a phenomenon which in the history of churches is quite old. So to reuse a church as a synagogue or a mosque, this is accepted by only 39% of respondents. So the question was, why a new beginning? This was about St. Johannes in Telgte. This is a church which actually was greenlit for demolition, but then many people opposed this in the congregation. They wanted to keep this building, and they checked whether maybe you could have this building listed. That was the case, and with the help of an architectural competition, they tried to find out whether you want to have a combined use of sacred and profane use. This is an ongoing process. At the moment, they have implemented various things and they have received several architectural awards. So they have been searching for various users, and this is a very important factor. Second question, what becomes of the city without a church? Church buildings are very much anchored in our cultural tradition and our memory. When children are to sketch a silhouette, they always sketch church towers, whether they are religious or not, but this just belongs to our concept of cityscapes. Here we have three examples. For example, this is the Capernaum Church in Hamburg-Hamm, which is now a mosque. So we have the word Allah here at the top, at the church tower. Then we have St. Agnes in Berlin by Werner Duttmann, which was already quite difficult to recognize as church even when it was built. And today it's a gallery. And the only thing that looks like a church was a big cross at the tower, which has now been taken down. The third example is the Martini Church in Bielefeld. Today it's a restaurant. The building still looks very much the same. The only thing what you see is the logo here at the entrance. The Lukas Church in Essen has been converted into flats. You hardly see anything of the church here on the outside. You just have this bell tower. But still, I always wonder for how long you will recognize this as a church bell tower. Another example is in Frankfurt. This church was too big. It was cut in half. The total length is still being used. It has been turned into a public place for the neighborhood, which has a very important role to play. What happens to the interior of the church? I think the visitors were already quite well prepared in the first part. Just two more examples. The GERALD Church in Bielefeld is now a synagogue, and there weren't that many changes in the interior. This was very much unchanged. Then I already mentioned the Kirchenumnutzung Church, which is now a mosque. Maybe one more example of St. Bernardus in Oberhausen. This church has been separated. One part is still a chapel. The other part has become a restaurant, so used for gastronomy and for events. And this is an example where many things were changed in the interior. This is now a publishing house that's inside. And of course, you need office space within this church. So last question, what do we do with the inventory? That's very interesting. When you have a new purpose for the church, what do you do with your organ, for example, or with the pews? It's oftentimes very artistic, has a high value. And now we have found a different use for these things. Let me rush through our last point. I can invite you to our website. It's a very complex website to our project with more information. And this is not so much about giving you good examples of renews, but to give congregations the opportunity to ask themselves, what do we need to take into account in our process? Legal aspects, church law, architecture, who needs to be involved. Maybe you have time to have a look at this afterwards on the website. You will find much more information regarding this. And I think I managed to finish in time. Thank you very much.